Monday morning, February 11th, 2019, a dispatch yard in Elizabeth, New Jersey. A dock supervisor named Ray, 31 years with the company, walks in expecting a normal shift. Except the trailers that should already be backed into the bays and loaded aren't moving. Nobody's called out sick. Nobody's on strike. The forklifts are just sitting there, engines off, and half the drivers are standing around in small groups checking their phones instead of their manifests. By lunchtime, someone finally hands Ray a printed letter. The company has filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Not to reorganize, to shut down completely. Ray has 31 years of seniority, a pension he's counted on, and by the end of that week, none of it will matter, because within days, thousands of people just like him will be handed the same letter with no warning at all. There was no town hall meeting first, no slow wind down with weeks of notice. Drivers who'd left home that morning with a full week of scheduled runs on the books were told by the afternoon there might not be a company left to pay them for the miles they'd already driven. Some of them had grandfathers who'd worked the same terminal. Some had turned down job offers from competitors 5 years earlier because this company felt like the safer bet, the one that had already survived everything the industry could throw at it. That belief is exactly what makes this story worth telling, because for a very long time it was completely true. Here's the part that should stop you cold. This wasn't some fly-by-night trucking outfit that popped up during the pandemic freight boom and folded the second rates dropped. This was one of the last unionized, less-than-truckload carriers left standing in the entire Northeast, a company whose roots traced back over 100 years that had somehow survived the exact wave of deregulation that killed nearly every one of its unionized competitors. For more than 4 decades under one family's leadership, this company did something the trucking industry considered close to impossible. And then, in the space of about a week, all of it was gone. The obvious assumption is that a company like this just ran out of luck, that the freight market turned and the numbers finally caught up with it. That assumption isn't wrong exactly, but the people who worked there for decades will tell you something sharper than that. They'll tell you it wasn't just bad luck. They'll tell you there was one specific decision made less than a year before the collapse that sealed the company's fate. And the strangest part of that story is who actually made that decision. It wasn't a boardroom of executives. It was the workforce itself, voting on a contract that might have been the only thing standing between survival and everything that happened next. To understand how strange that is, you have to go back to where this company actually came from, because almost nobody who watched it collapse in 2019 knew its real origin story. It didn't start as a trucking company at all. In 1918, a small delivery outfit in northern New Jersey was hauling baked goods for a biscuit company and dairy products for a local creamer, nothing more than a handful of trucks moving local freight. Over the following decades, it passed through different owners, eventually landing with a dairy processor who renamed the operation after the New England routes it had picked up along the way. By the 1970s, it was a struggling, barely profitable carrier running just 55 trucks out of 4 small terminals, exactly the kind of company most people would have bet against. In 1977, a New Jersey trucking executive named Myron Shevel bought it. Shevel wasn't new to this business, and he wasn't new to watching it go wrong either. He had run a different trucking operation with his brother years earlier, one that had collapsed spectacularly in the mid-1970s when it overreached trying to take over a much larger competitor. Shevel took what he'd learned from that failure and rebuilt from almost nothing, buying this small, unglamorous carrier and quietly growing it year after year. Then, in 1980, the entire industry got turned upside down. Federal deregulation tore up the rulebook that had protected unionized trucking companies for decades, and almost overnight, non-union carriers with lower costs started eating unionized firms alive. Company after company that had operated under labor contracts for generations folded within a few years. This is the part almost everyone gets wrong when they hear this story secondhand. The common assumption is that a unionized carrier surviving deregulation must have quietly abandoned its labor agreements to compete. This one didn't. It kept its union contract, kept its drivers under collective bargaining, and somehow kept growing anyway, expanding routes into the Midwest, into Canada, into Puerto Rico, while nearly every other union carrier its size was disappearing off the map entirely. Industry watchers at the time called it close to a contradiction. A union freight carrier wasn't supposed to be able to do what this one was doing. Here's a detail most people retelling this story get wrong too, and it matters more than it sounds like it should. Almost every other unionized trucking collapse from this era involves the Teamsters, the union most people automatically associate with the entire industry. This company's drivers and dock workers actually belong to a different union entirely, the machinists, a detail that even seasoned freight reporters occasionally mix up when they write about it. It's a small correction, but it matters, because it means this wasn't a story about one union's particular deal with one particular company. It was simply one privately held, family-run carrier that had figured out how to make a union labor model work in an industry that was actively punishing every other company that tried. By 2017, that once tiny 55-truck operation had grown into the 17th largest less-than-truckload carrier in the entire country, pulling in more than $400 million in annual revenue, running over 1,000 power units out of dozens of terminals across the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic. For a company built on a labor model that was supposed to be a competitive death sentence after 1980, that kind of survival wasn't just success, it was an anomaly the whole industry studied. But here's a detail from those growth years that almost nobody connects to the trucking story at all, and it's worth pausing on because it's simply true and genuinely strange. The founder's daughter served for years as an executive vice president inside the company, playing an active role in how it was run. In 2011, she married a former member of one of the most famous rock bands in history. It's a strange little footnote to a freight company's history, the kind of detail that would feel made up if it weren't thoroughly documented in the press at the time. And it's a small reminder that behind every logo on the side of a truck, there's usually a far stranger family story than anyone assumes. That family feeling wasn't just a headquarters thing either. And this is where a driver like Ray's own history actually starts. He joined the company back in the late 1980s after a stint with a competitor that treated its dock workers, in his words, like interchangeable parts. Here, seniority actually meant something. Route assignments were fought over but respected once they were earned. Supervisors who'd started on the same loading dock decades earlier still knew half the drivers' names and their kids' names too. It wasn't perfect, and there were plenty of hard years and tense contract negotiations along the way, but it was the kind of workplace where people genuinely planned on retiring, not just surviving until the next opportunity came along. That's exactly why nobody on that dock in Elizabeth saw the ending coming the way it actually arrived. Now here's where the story turns, because everything up to this point sounds like a company that had figured something out, a business that had beaten the odds so many times that collapse should have been the last thing anyone expected. And for a long stretch, it looked exactly like that. Awards, growth, decades of stability, while competitors folded one after another. So, what actually happened? By 2018, the numbers behind the scenes told a very different story than the one on the surface. The company had absorbed 2 consecutive years of significant financial losses. Its fleet was aging and increasingly expensive to maintain, at the same time as a nationwide driver shortage was pushing labor costs higher across the entire industry. A handful of very large retail shippers, one of them a major e-commerce giant, had locked the company into contracts with margins so thin that some analysts said the volume wasn't even worth carrying. Management needed relief somewhere, and in 2018 they went to the union with a proposal to change certain contract terms, including how overtime was structured, changes designed to help control the very costs that were quietly bleeding the company dry. None of this happened in a vacuum either. Around the same time, larger, non-union competitors were pouring money into automated sorting terminals and newer, more fuel-efficient trailers. The kind of capital investment a company already absorbing losses simply couldn't match. Replacing an aging fleet costs real money. Money this company didn't have the margin to spend while it was busy hauling deeply discounted freight for customers it couldn't afford to lose. Every year it delayed those upgrades to preserve cash, made the company slightly less competitive. The following year, a slow, almost invisible erosion that wouldn't show up as a single bad headline until it was far too late to reverse. The union membership voted the proposal down. Sit with that for a second, because it's easy to rush past it on the way to the ending. A company that had survived nearly 40 years of an industry actively trying to kill anything union-run. A company that had weathered deregulation, recessions, fuel price shocks, and the slow death of nearly every competitor its size, came down. In the end, to a single vote in a single union hall on a single evening in 2018 that almost nobody outside the building even knew was happening. No headline ran the next morning. No stock ticker moved. It was just thousands of ordinary people making an ordinary decision about their own paychecks, with absolutely no way of knowing they were casting the vote that history would eventually point back to. At the time, it barely made news outside the trade press. Inside the industry, though, people who studied the freight market closely later pointed to that single vote as the moment the math stopped working. One well-known logistics consultant who tracked the company for years put it plainly afterward, saying the timing of that rejected vote couldn't have been worse, coming right as the company's financial cushion was already gone. It wasn't malice, it wasn't sabotage, it was thousands of individual workers, each one protecting overtime pay they'd earned and depended on, making a completely rational choice in the moment, one none of them could have known would help set off everything that followed within 12 months. Because here's what happened next, and this is the part that turns a slow financial decline into a sudden, brutal collapse. The company had been running on a web of financial lifelines, including tens of millions of dollars in letters of credit spread across roughly a dozen different banks, arrangements that had to be renewed periodically just to keep operations funded. In early 2019, those letters of credit started failing to renew, one after another, until the company was staring at a hole of more than $30 million it had no way to fill. There was no dramatic boardroom showdown, no headline-grabbing scandal. Just a cash crunch that had been building quietly for 2 years, finally running out of road all at once. On February 11, 2019, the company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and instead of the usual restructuring plan companies use to survive that process, it announced it would use the filing to wind the entire business down completely. Within days, more than 3,400 workers across dozens of terminals were let go, most of them with no advance notice at all, a fact that later triggered a federal lawsuit under labor laws requiring advance warning of mass layoffs. The company eventually agreed to boost its severance payments from an initial offer of $13 million to nearly $16 million to settle that case. But for most of the workforce, the sudden ending never really got a real explanation, just a printed statement citing rising costs and a driver shortage. At the time, trade publications called it the largest trucking company collapse in 17 years, since a much larger competitor had gone under in 2002. And here's where the story earns its final, harder turn, the one that complicates the neat version everyone likes to tell. Because if you ask the people who worked there, plenty of them will still tell you today that one vote, one contract rejected in 2018 is the reason the company doesn't exist anymore. And in a narrow sense, they're not wrong, because that decision really did remove one of the last tools management had to slow the bleeding. But the harder truth, the one that shows up in the actual financial filings and not just in the stories workers tell each other, is that the company was already absorbing unsustainable losses well before that vote ever happened. An aging fleet nobody could afford to replace. Contracts with major shippers that were already squeezing margins to nothing. A driver shortage driving labor costs up across the entire industry regardless of what any single union vote decided. The rejected contract didn't create the crisis. It just closed off one of the last exits before the crisis arrived anyway. That's usually how these stories actually work, and it's worth sitting with for a second because it's more honest than either version alone. It's rarely one clean, single decision that destroys a company that survived for decades. It's usually a company that's been absorbing damage quietly for years, right up until one moment, one vote, one missed renewal on a line of credit finally removes the last piece keeping the whole structure standing. From the outside, it looks sudden. From the inside, everyone who lived through those final 2 years will tell you they saw it coming, piece by piece, long before that Monday morning in February when the letters started going out. It's also worth asking what actually would have happened if that vote had gone the other way. Even the most optimistic version of that alternate history doesn't end with the company thriving forever. At best, a different vote buys a few more years, maybe enough time to weather one more freight cycle, maybe enough time to refresh part of the aging fleet before the next downturn arrived anyway. Nobody who studied the finances closely believed one contract change alone would have fixed a business model already being squeezed from every direction at once. What it might have done is turn a sudden headline-making collapse into a slower, quieter decline, the kind that ends with a sale to a competitor instead of a liquidation notice taped to a terminal door. Sometimes the difference between a dramatic ending and an ordinary one really does come down to something that small. What makes this particular collapse sting in a way a lot of trucking bankruptcies don't is exactly what made the company remarkable in the first place. This wasn't a company that cut corners to survive deregulation. It was one of the rare ones that didn't, that kept its union contracts and its family culture intact for over 40 years, while nearly every comparable competitor folded around it. Watching an institution like that go out, not in some dramatic public failure, but in a quiet cascade of unrenewed credit lines and one contract vote, nobody outside the industry noticed at the time, feels almost anticlimactic for a company that had beaten the odds for that long. There was no final confrontation, no single villain to point to. Just decades of resilience meeting a freight market that finally didn't leave enough room for a single mistake, one vote, one bad year, one squeeze too many. What makes this particular collapse sting in a way a lot of trucking bankruptcies don't is exactly what made the company remarkable in the first place. This wasn't a company that cut corners to survive deregulation. It was one of the rare ones that didn't, that kept its union contracts and its family culture intact for over 40 years, while nearly every comparable competitor folded around it. Watching an institution like that go out, not in some dramatic public failure, but in a quiet cascade of unrenewed credit lines and one contract vote nobody outside the industry noticed at the time, feels almost anticlimactic for a company that had beaten the odds for that long. There was no final confrontation, no single villain to point to. Just decades of resilience meeting a freight market that finally didn't leave enough room for a single mistake, one vote, one bad year, one squeeze too many. And this company was far from alone in that particular ending. A legendary competitor many times its size had collapsed the same way back in 2002, one of the biggest trucking bankruptcies in American history up to that point. A once fabled truckload carrier built on international trade routes would collapse into fraud charges against its own executives that same year. This company finally shut its doors. And barely 4 years later, an even larger, nearly century-old trucking giant would go through an almost identical final act, worn down by debt and labor disputes until one bad stretch was all it took to end it completely. Zoom out far enough, and this isn't really one company's story at all. It's the same ending playing out again and again across an entire industry, always with a slightly different name painted on the door and a slightly different final straw, but always the same slow erosion followed by one sudden vote, one missed payment, one Monday morning nobody saw coming until it already had. Today, the terminals that once ran 24 hours a day sit quiet, the trucks long since auctioned off or absorbed into other fleets, the routes divided up among the competitors that were left standing. Drivers like Ray, the ones who gave their working lives to a company that outlasted everyone else in its category for 4 decades, ended up scattered across a dozen other carriers, carrying seniority that no longer meant anything, and a story that most people outside the industry have never heard. Ask any of them what killed the company, and they won't reach for balance sheets or letters of credit. They'll tell you about one vote in one union hall in the summer of 2018, and they'll tell you that everything after that was just the slow part of an ending that had already been decided. So the next time you see a trucking company with decades of history suddenly disappear from the highway, don't assume it was reckless or careless or badly run. Some of the most respected names in this industry survived things that should have killed them years earlier, only to lose everything to something as ordinary as one contract vote, one credit line, one very bad year that happened to land on top of several other very bad years. The road doesn't care how long you've been running it. If you worked in trucking, or LTL freight, or logistics during any of these industry collapses, tell me which one hit you the hardest, and whether you saw it coming before the headlines did, because I read every comment. If you're a driver who remembers the day your own company's doors closed without warning, this one probably feels familiar in ways that are hard to put into words, and the comments section is exactly the place to put them anyway. And if this is the first time you've heard how a company can survive 50 years of an industry trying to kill it, only to go under in a single week, let me know down below what other trucking company collapse you want broken down like this one next. Hit like if this changed how you'll look at every truck you pass with a faded old logo on the door, and subscribe, because there are a lot more of these stories still waiting to be told.